Excuse me? Oh, can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me okay? Yep. Brilliant. Excellent. So Jessie will be joining us later, but unfortunately George is no longer able to make it. But we'll make a start anyway, and Jessie can jump in the conversation later along. So hello everyone, and welcome to this Bright Blue Fringe event. For those of you that don't know us, Bright Blue is an independent think tank and pressure group for defending and improving liberal society. Our work covers 4 main areas on employment, education, environment, and social policy. And today's event in partnership with CropLife UK is titled Britain's Farming Future. Sustainable farming and ecosystem services are something that Bright Blue has done work on in the past. In particular, we wrote a report, Greener and More Pleasant Land, which I encourage you all to have a read of. It's not available in all bookshops, but it is available on our website, so please do have a look. The report discussed how once the UK had left the EU and the Common Agricultural Policy, how we can change farming and landowner subsidies to provide ecosystem services, and this report helped to inform the current environment land management scheme, or ELMS, that we have today. And I'm sure this is something we'll be hearing more about in the conversations. And also now with concerns around the recent Labour government perhaps lacking specific funding commitments for agriculture to support the transition to more sustainable farming practices. It would also be good to hear the speaker's thoughts on the future of nature-friendly farming. So just briefly how this event will work. Each of our panellists will provide opening thoughts, comments and ideas that will last roughly 5 minutes, and will then open up the discussion to our audience for questions and responses to those. There will also be people joining us digitally who can ask questions via the Slido link, which is should be just below the video. So do put your name, where you're from, and ask a question via that link. And of course, do tweet about this event using the hashtag CPC24 and the hashtag and at the Twitter handle is We Are Bright Blue, and also do have a look through our other conference events, as you'll see the material on your seats. So the discussion that we're having today is really about getting the balance right between food production, food security, and the provision of ecosystem services, and whether the current regulations and policies, specifically ELMS, effectively delivers this balance. And beyond that, it's about the potential for new technologies, for example, genetically modified crops and other innovative farming techniques to boost crop productivity and ensure that the agricultural sector is on track to achieve its net zero emissions targets. So joining me in this discussion today will be Fiona Harvey, who is the environment correspondent at The Guardian, Robert Sheasby, Chief Executive of the Agricultural Industries Confederation, the trade association which represents agribusiness in the UK, and Josh Woolsoncroft, who serves as the head of external affairs at CropLife, the voice of the UK plant science industry. And hopefully later on in the discussion, Jessie Norman will be joining us, and Jessie is the Member of Parliament for Hereford and South Herefordshire, and was previously Minister of State for the Department of Transport, with a focus on decarbonisation. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Fiona to give her opening remarks.
Thank you very much. And it's great to see such a fantastic turnout for this event, because I think farming is one of the huge issues that we've got to look at here. I've been writing about farming and the environment for 20 years, and farming has changed a lot in that time. But I think that in the next 20 years, it could change out of all recognition. And some of those changes are in ways that people will really dislike. So if we want to take control of our farming future, we've got to do so now. I speak to a lot of farmers, and one of the things that I'm hearing a lot of, and that I'm sure you'll hear a lot of at this conference, is people are worried about net zero. A lot of farmers want to kind of relax the NFU's goal of trying to reach net zero by 2040. Farmers are worried about things like rewilding. They're worried about, land being used to grow trees and forestry to soak up carbon and generate carbon credits instead of being used for food production. They're worried about solar farms. And to a lesser extent wind farms taking over land that could be used for food production. And these are all, these concerns must be taken seriously. But let's take the broader picture as well. Farmers want to produce food primarily, and a lot of farmers would like to go back to just really having food production as a goal. The days when they could just say, well, we're producing food, it's increasing the UK's self-sufficiency, it's keeping the nation healthy, and, that's what we do, that's our job. And there's a great attraction with that. But let's look, for instance, at other countries and what their experience is. Because here in the UK, small farmers are still the backbone of the countryside. And I'm sure if you asked, let's ask people in the hall, do you think that small farming should have a future in the UK? Yep, pretty much. Yep, I do too. Yep. My grandparents ran a small farm. I was born in the city, but we still had close connections to it. Lots of people, even if they're in the city, have kind of rural connections of some kind or another. Most people, if you ask them, would say we do want small farms to continue in the UK. Well, let's look at what happens when you concentrate on food production. Let's look at America, where there simply are fewer and fewer small farms. Huge swathes of small farms have disappeared across America. Neither are these huge kind of consolidated enormous farms, and a lot of the people who would have had small farms are essentially reduced to the condition of being landless labourers. And the enormous farms, the mega farms that have taken over America are immensely efficient. They're very, very good at food production, but they're not the farms that we're used to. Similarly, if you look across Europe, again, you're seeing massive consolidation there. There's a huge number now of mega farms, really big farms. If you look at the people who make the most money from the Common Agricultural Policy and so on, they are the biggest farmers, and the smallest farmers are being squeezed out. There are fewer and fewer small farms across Europe every year, and that trend is showing no sign of abating. In fact, it's accelerating. So if we are going to concentrate on food production and take our eyes off these other environmental goods that scare people, like rewilding, like growing trees and so on, like making your land into a carbon sink or devoting more land to biodiversity, and we do prioritise food production, then that's the way things are going to go. It's going to be very, very difficult to maintain small farms if we go wholeheartedly in that direction. That's why, actually, I think if we're going to make a choice, and we want to choose a good future, a bright future for small farming, then we do have to admit that small farms will need to have far more goals in view than just food production. Food production will be in there as one of their important goals, but they will have to concentrate on some of the things that make people feel a bit uncomfortable today, like the rewilding, like the biodiversity, the habitats, and so on. Because if we don't make this choice actively, then what will happen in America and Europe will happen here, and that choice will be made for farmers, and they won't like it.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for those opening remarks. I actually briefly just wanted to touch on a piece of your recent writing, which was around the use of antibiotics in livestock, and this was as a result of a new law being passed, because obviously the UK was no longer subject to the EU regulations. And I just wondered whether I think it touches on some of the issues that you mentioned in your opening remarks, where you see kind of the key sort of challenges for British farming like post-Brexit, whether that's specifically for small farms or otherwise?
Well, small farms are living in a different regulatory environment, and there's a great temptation to see that as red tape. It's not really red tape. The regulations are there mostly for good reasons, even if they're not always applied in the most sensible way. And we see what happens when the regulations are not properly enforced. Our rivers are teeming with sewage, which is one of the reasons why this party is out of government. And the sewage in our rivers, the pollution in our rivers is about half of it's down to sewage, but about half of it's down to farming. And farms are simply, for many years now, farms have been not inspected properly. Farmers have been allowed and encouraged to get away with polluting our waterways. And so when you view something that is actually a sensible regulation as red tape, then that's the result. So, yes, there's a different regulatory environment now that we've left the EU. But if we were to derogate far from those EU standards, then I think that we would pay the price. You mentioned antibiotics. There's a very, very good reason for heavily regulating antibiotics in farming, and it is that antibiotics are essential for human health. We're facing a future in which they're not going to work, and that means that when you go to hospital, you will be, a routine operation could now be life-threatening. So there's a very good reason why we regulate antibiotics, regulate them carefully. It's not red tape, it's sensible regulation.
Thank you very much. So just to follow up very briefly on that, you mentioned around water pollution. Obviously, there'll be new regulation going in force to give water regulators greater power for around licensing. Do you think there should be scope for sort of the ELMS targets reduction sufficient on areas of pollution reduction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to look very closely at farming pollution, and we need to look, the Labour government is cracking down on water companies, which is a good start. You can argue they should be much more fierce with the water companies, and perhaps they will be. But they haven't really, the new Labour government has not really turned its attention to pollution from farming yet, and they do need to. I'm not suggesting that all farmers are polluting, not at all, but there is a great temptation to many farmers to pollute because they are facing, difficult economic times. Their margins are under a lot of pressure. A lot of farmers, they don't pollute actively on purpose, but they kind of do it because, they don't have the money to invest or whatever. I'm afraid that we do need tighter regulation on pollution from farming, though, and we need the Environment Agency and other regulators to actually step in more.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to bring Robert into discussion here. So emissions from farming have certainly decreased, but agriculture does still contribute to around 12% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. So, for instance, from fertilisers, manure and methane. Do you think that sort of there is capacity to achieve the balance between sort of food security and environmental protection whilst kind of still achieving net zero targets?
Without a doubt, Sarah. It's clear to me, AIC members, we're providing those inputs to agriculture that food can't be produced. So if you want food security in this country, you can't do that without agriculture inputs. So AIC members are working across animal feed, arable marketing, crop protection and agronomy, seed, to ensure British farmers have access to the inputs they require. And we can't do that without a clear strategy. We need to encourage inward investment into the UK to ensure we've got access both to the resilience that we expect, the nation expects, in order to be able to feed itself, but also to deliver on some of the things that have been talked about. If we're going to have a truly sustainable and net zero ambition, then we've got to be investing in those policy areas to encourage business, to encourage inward investment, and we need those signals from government and opposition to support that. And that's why, look, being here today is a great opportunity to widen that conversation into what can be done. So you've got to have profitable agriculture. If we're going to deliver net zero, as a well-used phrase, you can't go green if you're in the red. So we've got to develop a place where business can be profitable and then it can invest in the future. But also you need to create that framework where wider business wants to invest in the UK. And it's notable today that the precision breeding legislation is starting to move forward. But the UK is attracting over half the investment in Europe into that area of innovation. But that's an area that can take forward UK agriculture and actually lead the world in a space where we can create a more resilient and arguably more sustainable area of agriculture. And that should be to the benefit of all farmers in the country as well as all consumers. But we've got to get that framework right. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact that there are some challenges here. We've got devolved agricultural policy across the United Kingdom. So we can't lose track of the changes, the policy development that's going on in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and ensuring that with the complexity of the Windsor Framework Agreement, we're well positioned that we don't jeopardise the ability of trade across the United Kingdom and in our own way damage that opportunity to have that resilience. So I think there is enormous opportunity for change, but what would really help is a strategy that gives a land use strategy that the country can get behind, that business can get behind, and be really clear about where the government sits and have the confidence to invest against that. We need to keep an eye on where divergence is happening to ensure that we don't end up with a challenge to trade, and that's one of the big concerns for business at the moment. And that's a concern for every farmer in this country, that if there are inequities to trade, whether that's with our nearest trading partners in Europe or more widely, that creates a challenge and an impact to profitability as well. We also should be ensuring that we get our sustainability metrics right. That creating a common field for sustainability metrics will ensure we have an even playing field, that business knows what it's trying to do. So when we talk about net zero, and whether that's by 2050 or by 2040 or 2045, take a number, we do first of all need to be crystal clear, not only on the metrics that we want to secure in this country, but actually the metrics that we're going to use around the world, so that there is truly a common metric, and that standard needs to be settled upon. And then lastly, I've touched on it a little bit more, but that chance to innovate, and if we can create that innovation, and precision breeding is that space where we can create longer rotations, greater cropping diversity, create a wider biodiversity, a greater soil health that can come from this innovation. But it requires that research and development, that confidence of business to invest, and therefore the profitability and confidence of farmers to invest in that new technology, that innovation that will take us through the next 40 years towards net zero in the future. That's probably a good place to pause.
Thank you very much. I just want to pick up briefly on the precision breeding point, as it does seem to be a post-Brexit opportunity. And for instance, around GMOs, they significantly enable decreasing emissions from, for instance, cows and livestock and their methane emissions. Yet there does seem to be some public scepticism and doubt around the use of GMO crops. Do you see any ways of how you can improve confidence in their use?
Yeah, well, the first point, Sarah, is to be really crystal clear. There is a very substantial difference between genetic modification and precision breeding or gene editing. And the CRISPR technology used that's been developed in this country, we've got some of the world's leading experts in East Anglia working around precision breeding, the CRISPR technology, where we can precision cut. It's just like conventional breeding, okay? If you were to put two wheat plants in a field, you're waiting for that cross-pollination to happen, and you get one opportunity a year to create that innovation. You have a 10-year lead time to get that innovation into the marketplace. Actually, with precision breeding, we can select the precise part of the plant we wish to bring in. So there's no different DNA coming into the plant. It's the exact same as traditional breeding, but we can accelerate that and do it multiple times a year and get the characteristics that will help us adapt to climate change, whether that's greater wet weather, increased drought, so drought tolerance, or even resistance to some of the pest challenges that our crops are going to face in the future. So we can actually really help resilience, not only in our maritime climate in the UK, but actually create technology that has an exportable value around the world. And that's something we should embrace. And that's something the Conservative government led the way with the initial legislation. I'm pleased to say that it seems to be taken forward by the government now, hot off the press today.
Thank you very much. I'll bring in Jessie into the discussion now, and I think Robert did outline pretty well the sort of the thriving nature of the UK agri-tech sector. But I just also wonder, was there more that we could be doing to support UK innovation and make our agri-tech business more internationally competitive?
Well, thank you very much. I mean, the answer is I have no idea, but I imagine there's a hell of a lot more we could do. I mean, our farm. I mean, obviously, I'm the MP for Hereford, South Herefordshire. We've got, forget East Anglia, we've got some of the best farmers in the world in Herefordshire, and we've been what should I say, creating high quality breeding for many, many years, long before CRISPR or gene editing ever existed. So what could we do? I mean, obviously, Robert's laid out a whole series of interesting areas for change. Precision agriculture is one, both in terms of herbicides and pesticides, but also, of course, in terms of breeding. AI, enormous data sets, thinking about robotics, machinery, self-driving vehicles in farm environments of different kinds. I mean, all that stuff is incredibly interesting and potentially valuable. And the UK actually is a leader in many of these different areas. If you talk to Oxa, a company formerly known as Oxbotica, based in Oxford, an autonomous vehicle company, one of the two UK leading autonomous vehicle companies across Europe, an awful lot of the applications they're thinking of are not on public roads. They're in factories, they're on farms, they're in other contexts, and I think we can massively benefit from that. So yes, now the question then is, well, what could government do? Well, we have UKRI. It's very surprising that more of our state-driven research investment is not into this area. There are certain lacunae, I would say, in certain areas. I think this is probably one of them. Another would be transport, which is quite interesting, obviously rather important from a farming standpoint as well. You've got to get the product to market. You've got to get different vehicles around the farmers we've discussed. So I think those are all areas in which government can focus on. I would say, I'm just picking up Sarah's point about rivers. I'm not very persuaded at the moment by the Labour government on this, candidly. They've been hopeless on the River Wye. There was an action plan for the Wye. There was a recognition that the farmers needed to be brought into a kind of long-term plan. 1,500 farmers in the catchment completely failed to pick that up at the moment. We've got a river champion ready to go, already doing work, completely failed to pick that up. So I'm not actually persuaded even by the Labour government's attempt to nationalise the water companies, if that's where they end up going, because I'm far from persuaded we'll get better outcomes if you and I are paying and civil servants are invigilating the performance of experts in water companies. That it may happen, it may not happen, but I think it's a reasonable basis for a Conservative MP. I see George Freeman isn't here, but if George were here, I'm sure he would be as sceptical as I am about many of these developments.
Thank you very much. I was, very interesting on the River Wye, as it's obviously butting in with the devolved regulations, so you get difficulties there in dealing with different...
No, I agree, but hold on a sec. Let's be clear. Governments and agencies have been hiding behind this issue on the Wye for 4 years. I raised it in 2020, and the Wye does cross the border. There's absolutely no reason why the agencies shouldn't cooperate much more closely together. There's absolutely no reason why the government shouldn't have a joint action plan for the Wye. None of these things has happened. And, of course, you do have an environment, you have a setup where the incentives could be, I'm not saying they are, but they could be, to play beggar my neighbour. Now, that's completely counterproductive because, of course, the Wye starts in Wales and it ends in Wales. But, the lack of concrete, tangible progress, despite a ton of lobbying and pressure, is evident. And I do hope this government will pick it up. They have the one merit that Labour now control both sides of the border, and you would think they'd be able to talk to each other. That may, of course, be a fond imagining.
Thank you very much. Just going to bring in Josh now, last and certainly not least. Just picking up on one of Jessie's points around AI and its transformative potential. Do you see it as being that sort of transformative driving force, or perhaps something that is has been overhyped?
I'm not sure about AI specifically, but I think just going to Fiona's sort of opening remarks that we're facing a kind of nexus point in agriculture. I think that's absolutely the case. I think what we've seen in recent years is a coming together of technologies ranging from AI, big data, gene editing, genetic modification, artificial nanoparticles in plant protection products, and all the kind of exciting things in between. And with the right support, with the right regulatory framework, then I think it's easy to imagine a farming future somewhat further down the line than the length of government, where farmers are able to farm much more productively using less land. According to experts, the high watermark potential yield for cereal crops is 14 to 19 tonnes per hectare. At the moment, we're achieving something like 7 to 9 tonnes. By increasing our productivity, we could see the rewilding and the other land uses that are being proposed being able to take into account the less productive land that could be brought out of circulation. I mean, Robert spoke about gene editing, and I went sort of bang on about that too much, but really exciting news today that Labour is bringing that forward. It was great to see the previous government bring forward the primary legislation supported by Labour. So happy to see that happening. But this is new technology in the UK, but it's not new technology around the world, and it coming back on the line will enable our farmers to be as productive and competitive as possible, whilst also breeding drought-resistant varieties with higher yields, more nutrition. In China, they're investing billions into powdery mildew-resistant wheat, and already genetically engineered maize produces 5.5 bushels more per acre than the conventionally bred. But if George was here, he'd have already said this several times before. But what the UK's not been able to do due to the regulatory barriers on genetic editing has been to take our considerable lead in genetic research, and that's only too much of a sort of a East Anglian mafia, the Rothamsted Institute, Rothamsted and John Innes Centre, and commercialise it. So this is an industry that's worth $12 billion around the world, and I think it's, as Rob said, we're leading the way in Europe in investment. I think it's incredibly exciting that we can see this coming down the line. Some of the barriers to that remain, and one of those is the regulatory system. And Fiona's point, I certainly wouldn't be advocating deregulation. I think you're absolutely right that characterising any kind of regulation as being red tape doesn't protect consumers and doesn't protect growers. I think it's a dangerous path to go down. What we do need to see is enabling regulation. So regulation, be it from autonomous vehicles or from conventional chemical pesticides, being delivered in the spirit that it was intended, with in a predictable, affordable and achievable way. I think what we also need to do is recognise the considerable work that growers have already done to make farming lower impact on the environment, particularly through integrated pest management, which is now very much the rule across the sector. Secondary legislation for genetic editing coming forward is a great start, but there are innovative technologies that are around the corner that need to know that the UK is a welcoming and enabling environment in the EU. But most importantly, if we want to see these technologies delivered and growers able to grow more productively and invest in the rewilding and energy production strategies that Fiona's talked about, then we need farming to be, in the short term and the medium term, to be as productive and profitable as possible. As Robert said, you can't go green whilst you're in the red.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the speakers for giving their opening remarks. We'll now open it up to the floor for questions. I ask that if you have a question you wish to ask one of our panellists, that you give your name and organisation that you represent before asking the question. And do please stand up just so we can hear you clearly. Do you have any questions from the floor? Gentleman in the blue jumper.
Forest. My question is, and it really follows on from the comments about the River Wye. We know what are the direct consequences of climate change is more extreme water events. We know that phosphates and nitrates going to watercourses is significantly important. And I recognise what you say about profitability in farming. How are we going to square the circle whereby our farmers can have that profitability to invest in technologies that reduce the impact on the environment? Because it worries me, we talk a lot about rewilding, we talk about all of those things. The fundamental there is the more nutrient we put into water supplies, the more we see the problems with regards to the River Wye, because you can only drive up past most of it at 20 miles an hour. You get the opportunity to see algal blooms when they occur. So, it's a real concern that, because I think, with the variability in weather, that we could have significant issues there that would give farming a bad name, because of course there's a direct causal link.
Who wants to jump in first for the question? Go ahead, Jesse.
I'm happy to. Sure. I think the truth of the matter is that we don't absolutely know there's a direct causal link. There is a belief, there's a very strong belief, and the Refocus study at Lancaster University suggests that there's a causal link. But there are at least three or... Sorry, I'm so sorry. The gentleman was talking about a causal link between inputs from farms and pollution in the River Wye and algal blooms. So the point is, we don't absolutely know there's a causal link, and the reason we don't is because no one has satisfactorily yet shown that that the problem isn't also correlated to water temperature, low flow, or non-phosphate pollutants. But it appears we can be relatively certain that it's runoff from the fields that's making a contribution to this, So the wider point that you raise, which is extreme weather events and runoff going together and giving farming a bad name. The truth of the matter is, though, that there are farmers who have been able to farm in a sustainable way that has not led to a lot of runoff, and they do that by ploughing against the grain across the hill, and they do it by leaving buffer areas, and elms and public goods for public money, when it's properly up and running, will reinforce this, and ideally will be supplemented with a river plan across both sides of the river that would allow for adequate buffer zones. But that's a very specific piece of project management you would need in order to make that improvement. The thing that's really going to change it is setting incentives differently for 1,500 farmers in the catchment and proper enforcement. Those are the two things that will really make it work.
Fiona, do you have a next question?
Yeah, I was just asking you, Jesse, just to clarify the point on the causal link, just because, I was just worried that you were disputing that there's a causal link between the pollution that's going into rivers and the results of that pollution that we see.
Sorry, we ought to just have a disagreement about this. In the case of the Wye, it's about 23% sewage and about 70% now runoff. And so the causation isn't quite the same as it is in many other areas where there's a very high level of sewage. So we don't help the cause by being anything other than quite particular. We think there's a link, we think there's a very strong link, but there may be other things in play, and it's important to be clear either way. Sorry.
Thank you for that clarification. That's very useful. The thing about the questioner mentioned that climate change is going to make this a great deal worse, and that's absolutely the case, and we are not geared up in any way for the consequences of that. And the Committee on Climate Change has an adaptation subcommittee, and they have found that British farming and all other forms of infrastructure around the country are just completely, woefully unprepared for what's going to happen when we get more flooding and, on the converse of that, more droughts. And we need, farms are going to have to adapt in very radical ways. We may need to re-wiggle rivers. We need to make more space for water. People may need to give up their attachment to dredging. There are lots of ways in which we are going to have to change the way that we do things in order to try and mitigate the impacts of some of these extreme weather events, and we can't delay on that.
So can I come in on this? Because undoubtedly there's a challenge in that catchment. But actually there's also an opportunity that comes out of here. And that opportunity is, Jesse touched on it a little bit there, about how, I've forgotten your name, Fiona, sorry, in the heat of the moment. They've both touched on, there are solutions in there, and that is about how farmers are managing those resources. And a big part of that actually is about having a nutrient management plan in place and thinking about what's there, how you're going to use it, undertaking the soil indices. And a big part of that is about having your professional advisor on farm to talk to you about your soil indices, so the metrics that are in your soil now, the crop nutrient, the nutrients you've got on the farm, and where the balance sits and how you utilise that. And that's the smart way I think policy needs to be developed, where perhaps the responsible competent agencies need to look at how are farmers and growers supported with managing those nutrients. And so whether that's about having a facts advisor come out on farm or an agronomist come out to talk through what the soil indices are, what the nutrient requirements of the crop are, and what the available nutrients are, and how to balance that out. Those are smart ways. And Jesse touched on using SFI options to think about how you're managing the land and applying nutrients and when you're doing it. Those are all things we can do to start to move us to a smarter place and maintain farming businesses in that part of the world. It's important, exactly, a very important agronomic part of the world.
Thank you very much. Josh, did you have any thoughts on the question?
Only to say that, you know, on a macro level, the question was also about profitability, and as we move into not necessarily a sort of heavy tech, but certainly more technological farming era, then it's vital that for growers to remain competitive, that they have as wide access to the tools that their international competitors have access to, be that conventional plant protection products, biopesticides, genetic technologies, etc.
Any further questions? I'll take two in a row, I think. There's a couple. Yes, the gentleman with the watch there. Yeah, and also gentleman there with the yellow tie. Yeah. Oh, so you go first. Yeah.
Hi, I'm David Lydiot. I'm from the Horticultural Trades Association, so very similar to some of your members of the panel, except think flora rather than edibles. Really interesting conversation. One of them, there are a lot of similarities between our sectors, and I think talking about water and water security, and despite obviously the flooding, I wonder the view on reservoirs and the ability for small businesses, small farms, small growers to be able to invest in reservoirs and water capture and recycling, and the challenges that they face. And just also make very quick points. One is about the runoff, fertilisers, and this push to go free means we're seeing an incredible amount of extra fertilisers having to go into the feed produce. So there's an additional runoff there. I'm wondering about how you're finding that. And just finally on the technology side, we're seeing it's very exciting industry for science and technology and what we could be capable of to produce and grow. And I think the sort of automation side of it, particularly sort of watering regimes, but also growing multiplication, that sort of thing, reducing weeds as well. So it's quite exciting. So I think there's a really good story to tell there.
Yeah, excellent. And the gentleman with the yellow tie. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tim Johnston, Isle of Man Government, previous dairy farmer for over 20 years. Thank you for this. Going back to what Fiona said at the start and talk about the challenges of small farms and viability, and Robert quite rightly said, the challenge of how do we go green when we're in the red as an industry. Clearly, what we're talking about here is the importance of investing in technology and efficiency, etc. But my question, I suppose, is how do we monetize that? How do we monetize that into a way that can make farming profitable? Because I think that's the key point. How do you make agriculture profitable? But one thing we haven't talked about, which maybe is the elephant in the room here, is the consumer and retailers. So we have some of the cheapest food in the world in the United Kingdom. How do we get the story, that we get that thread that adds value to what farmers do, that tells a story that consumers get and are willing to pay a premium for? Because that's the only way I think agriculture is going to be profitable.
We'll go to the tackle the reservoir question first. Does anyone have any initial comments around that?
So, yeah, water scarcity is a challenge, much as it doesn't feel like it on a day like today, and perhaps the last year that we've had. there are still challenges. And I'm lucky. A few years ago, I lived in Lancashire, where I emptied my rain gauge every day. I now live in Suffolk, where I empty it about once a month, until last autumn, and suddenly that's changed. But if we haven't got water in the right place for business to be able to use, for the public to be able to use, we do face a major challenge. It's a bit like electricity. People expect to flick the light switch and the lights to come on. People expect to turn the tap in their houses and the water to come out. Yet we've got pressure to build more houses to meet the needs of the population. And actually, if we want to grow the high-value crops that will benefit the consumer in the UK, we also need to have access to that water. So whether that's working at a greenhouse level and creating storage tanks close by, or at a more macro level on wider farms, or thinking about how we utilise and extract water out, and when we can extract water out of watercourses in times of surplus. So rather than taking what is now a more seasonal approach, it feels, to water, actually being smarter, that when we're having excess rain, there's a smarter way of measuring, actually, is there a surplus that we could start to recharge and utilise water in that way. I think that's definitely something we've got to look at, I think, a bit more smartly. And for those larger water storage areas, perhaps we do need to think about the legislation and ensuring that planning enables businesses to invest for its needs to be more resilient for the future, rather than us being tied up by legislation that comes from a slightly different era.
I mean, if I can just follow up on that and just come to the point Tim raised, I think there's a very serious problem here. I mean, nothing we have said today, and no conceivable policy suite that I'm aware of, is going to abolish the economics of the relationship between the consumer's appetite for ever cheaper food and the stranglehold exercised by the supermarkets. And the problem is that you can get what we already see, which is continuous innovation and product improvement in many ways across the sector, but without any increase in overall profit margins. I mean, not everyone can be, as it were, the recognized premium player in a market, because for there to be premium, there have to be non-premium. So I think that's the real issue, and there's no evidence that any government has really engaged with that issue over 30 or 40 years. And obviously there are certain farming areas, milk would be a classic example, in which the real price of the product hasn't increased, well, in the last 20 years that I can think of. By the way, with enormous hardship on farms as a result.
Did you want to address either the reservoir or the question about the consumers?
Yes, I think it's absolutely clear that we definitely need more reservoirs, because we haven't built any in the last, 40 years? I can't remember exactly when, but it's a long time. But also we need to make it easier for farmers to store water on farms. We need to do that. I think it would help if farmers were rewarded in some way for helping to store water on farms, because obviously if you, for instance, allow some fields to flood, those fields are no longer necessarily as productive as they would have been. Doesn't mean they're completely unproductive, but sometimes they won't be productive. And so you're delivering a good for yourself and other farmers and other people around you who are not flooding because you've done this. So you should be rewarded for that. I think that needs to be developed. That was started under the previous government, really needs to be developed a lot more, so that farmers can see that benefit, and it's made easier for farmers to store water in various ways on their farms. In terms of the economics of farming and food is a very, very profitable business in this country, but very, very little of the money goes to farmers. Partly that's because of the stranglehold of the supermarkets and the big retailers. Something needs to be done about that. I think really only the government can do something about that, and they need to take action on that. But ultimately, ultimately we need to look at the broader picture and the economics of this country as a whole, because frankly, people need cheaper and cheaper food because more and more of their money goes on rent.
Josh, I think you said you wanted to add a few remarks there.
I think the economics and reservoir question we dealt with, but just talk to David's point on the technology in the horticulture sector. There's some great sort of low and high technology advancements being made. I was lucky enough to go on a visit to a couple of farms down in the south coast, and some of the work that's going on there is fantastic. Not just for growing more productively, but also improving workplace safety, reducing exposure to operators. So yeah, there should definitely be some support there, some recognition for what a great industry horticulture is and the challenges that they're facing, particularly around kind of product availability. It's already a sector that's investing in biopesticides, but there are regulatory challenges to bringing new ones on the market and to how they are being used and how they're being best delivered. So no, good luck to you. Hopefully you're going to the berry reception this evening.
A couple more questions from the audience. Oh, there's several. Yes, the gentleman there and the gentleman in the front. We'll go to the gentleman first.
One of the comments really is that you simply have one solution to everything, because you've got the 100-acre fields in East Anglia and then you've got the small hill farms in the middle of Wales and bits like that. So one's got to bear in mind that thing. And my other comment as well, I mean, I've only got a background of farming, not directly involved in it, but the younger generation just don't seem to be coming into technology, especially in the area I live. We were just talking in conversation amongst the farming friends. You know, when I was young, there is no new generation coming on to take the family farms. They're not profitable enough. It's more boring life in many cases. And they're struggling to actually find somebody to take the farms on in 10, 15, 20 years' time, which is when this stuff has got to be implemented.
Thank you. And the gentleman in the front's question.
Roger Pawley, local farmer. This question of gene editing or gene CRISPR,
Precision breeding.
precision breeding. I think you've been slightly generous in your description of the precision involved, and the ones you select for development, do they breed true after, say, 2 or 3 generations?
I think, well, we're at the cutting edge of this technology at the moment. I'm not aware that they revert back, but you bring in the technology, because it's no different to the crossing you're doing in the field, where you're bringing in the traits that you want to. So I suppose there's always a chance that you get further cross-pollination in subsequent years that will lead to further development of the plant. But if you're starting out with your raw material, raw genetic material of the seed at the start, having bred it from the previous season, that's the product you've got, and that's what you will go into the field with. So I'm not sure.
I think they have a tendency to revert.
Okay.
Any selective breeding.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with that any selective breeding, unless you stay on top of the breeding itself, whether that's the breeding we do today or the breeding we might do tomorrow, there's always going to be a risk that where you get that cross breeding that follows in subsequent years. But I suppose that's partly why when we talk about how seed breeding happens, that we would suggest that farmers are best placed when they're buying first generation seed rather than relying on perhaps second or third generation farm safe seed, where you can lose some of the genetic benefits that come with that perfect bred seed in the first season.
I've generally worked with farm safe seed, and when we go down the tracks that you're describing, for small farmers it puts us more and more into the grip of agribusiness suppliers and less able to preserve the type of agriculture, the small farm agriculture.
I think, Roger, I'll happily talk to you afterwards, but
You have 15
I would say
minutes.
it's available for, I would hope it's available for every farmer. But let's have a conversation afterwards about what that might look like.
I think just to sort of talk about kind of the public perception of genetic technologies, I think there's quite a kind of rosy image of what conventional breeding looks like. That it's sort of someone in their greenhouse with a spray can and a toothpick, but it's using chemicals and radiation to disrupt genes. I understand that a retailer took seed produced by a male sterilisation technique off the shelves because it made the male buyers feel a bit uncomfortable.
Do you want to jump into either? I'm just conscious. Was there anyone? Do either of you want to address the question about encouraging young farmers into the business?
The gentleman who raised that, you're absolutely right. There is a challenge to how we find new entrants, but actually we're in a competitive marketplace, whether that's new entrants to come into agriculture or horticulture, or to come into seed breeding, or to find nutritionists for animal feed. But actually, we in this room have a collective responsibility to talk about the opportunities that exist for a very positive future of agriculture. And I understand completely the economics on farm, but that doesn't mean we can't find a way to talk about a policy landscape that presents a bright future. I come from a generation that was in the early 90s, where a lot of people were dissuaded. When I went to agricultural college, there were not vast numbers. But now you see the consequence of that bubble. There are not a wider group of people of my age group around in the industry. But actually, if we talk up the opportunities, we look at what the potential looks like, it's not just about being able to have a farm, but it is about being able to access to land. So there's county farms available still across the country. I know it was debated on farming today this morning, but still, if we talk about the opportunities, talk about the jobs, not just straight on farm, but across the wider agricultural economy, then I think we can create an interesting space where saving the planet, feeding the world is quite an exciting thing to do, and creating greater biodiversity in the UK through using smarter farming techniques, using the SFI options, looking at IPM. There is quite an exciting story to be a part of, but that's intent upon all of us.
Jesse?
I mean, just to add to that, I mean, obviously in Herefordshire, we've got a very wide range of farms. We've got some very large farms and we've got some very small farms. And, we've got tenanted and non-tenanted, and we've got kind of industrial size and operation and very, very kind of family-based. And it is undoubtedly a challenge. Many young people actually, in many ways, would like to stay connected to their farm, but they don't necessarily want to have that as their only source of income or that as their only future. And one of the things that's really exciting about what's happening in Herefordshire is we're just building a new university, the first one since the University of Buckingham in the 1970s, the New Model Institute. And what's so fascinating, graduates are starting to come out, and what's so fascinating is the opportunity that gives to young people from farming backgrounds. Because as you start to get lifelong learning entitlements breaking up degrees, you will be able to study at a university like NMIT, as it's called, in the fallow period between, say, October and March, over 2 or 3 years, and build up a bachelor's degree. And as an engineer, to a very high quality. We've just had a student, one of our first students, who's turned down a job. I just want to get it's just, this is, everything I'm about to say is true. You're not going to believe it, but everything just turned down a job with JCB in order to run a project in Cambridgeshire doing ag automation in fruit picking. He was working on a farm 3 years ago. He's a master's student. And his life has been transformed by that. And so I think there are tremendous opportunities to young people on farms, but we've just got to find a way of being more creative and more open-ended. And higher education of this kind, accelerated, very practical higher education, is a way of doing that. There'll be other ways as well, but this is one way of doing it, which we're trying to pioneer in my county.
I'm just conscious of time, so we're going to take another last round of questions if anyone has any short burning questions they want to ask. Yes, I see there's a lady with her arm up right at the back. Yes.
Hi, I'm Becca Beale. I work for Birmingham Inglehime, which is a pharmaceutical company. But I have worked in agricultural policy for quite a number of years and represented farmers for quite a long time in my previous role. Just a point of clarity, antibiotic use in livestock has reduced by 59% since 2014, and that's been done on a voluntary basis, which is quite impressive from the agricultural sector. Part of that is collaboration. The industry and government have worked together. And being mindful of what this gentleman raised about bringing younger people into the industry, some of the best policy I've been involved in over the last few years has been really, truly collaborative between industry and government. Should we not be bringing younger people into that collaboration to involve them in what they want the future of farming to look like? And how could we do that? Because, I'm nearly 40. I'll be gone in 20 years' time. It's the next wave of people that are coming through. 30 maybe. But actually, it's the young people that are going to deliver the food for us when we're, retired. How
Was there any other question? Last question? Yes, the lady there, yeah.
Sheep and beef cattle. We've mentioned the consumer. Ultimately, that is, we're talking about collaboration with young people, the collaboration with the consumer, because part of the pressure that I can see on farmers, particularly with the meat industry, is the insistence on consuming meat that is far too cheaply produced. It is not right for a chicken to be £4, and that we have to address. And I know we've talked about having government intervention. There has to be, in my opinion, a bit of personal responsibility for the consumer. So I would ask the panel, how do we nobble that education, and I'll nick your word, collaboration with the gorgeous consumer? Thank you.
Yeah,
Either of those questions?
if I could just touch on the first question first around attracting young people into the sector. I think that agriculture is becoming an increasingly attractive and interesting and exciting industry. It's never been true that farmers are just farmers, but it's more true than it's ever been that they are chief executives, and they are people managers and scientists and economists and all the things in between. And I think that there is an opportunity as farming becomes more mechanised and more exciting and more technological, that young people will be attracted to it. I think Tom from NFU made this point last week, but one of the barriers is that a lot of farming, particularly in farming families, is waiting for dad or possibly granddad to retire before you can start doing it. Perhaps if we want to get younger people into farming, it might be contingent upon older farming generations to step aside before it's too late for their children or grandchildren to pick it up.
Fiona?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the point about antibiotics. It's absolutely right that the use has come down massively, and that is owing to collaboration between farmers and the industry, and many people have been involved in that. It's been really good. We need to keep pushing, though, because there's still a long way to go on that, in particular in the use of the very strong antibiotics, which the World Health Organization says should not be used on animals at all. So there's an argument for banning colistin, some other antibiotics there. So we need to yes, we need to look at the progress that's been made so far and congratulate people on that, but move forward. And on this question of the consumer, I absolutely agree that we should not be having £4 chickens. And I think there's a slightly uncomfortable truth there for many people, which is that we do need to eat less meat, both for the climate and for our own health. And for animal welfare. We need to perhaps move our mindsets. This goes for everyone's personal responsibility and for farming as a whole, that instead of eating more and more meat, we should be eating less and less, but of a higher quality. And that could benefit everyone.
Thanks. Any
Okay, in terms of attracting new people, when I look at my daughters, the amount of time they spend watching interpretive dances on TikTok, perhaps in this room we should come up with a TikTok dance that would encourage people to enter into agriculture or the wider ag supply industry. So, yeah, form an orderly queue and we'll judge the best dance.
Oh, but I'd be thrilled.
Perhaps we'll judge it after the karaoke tonight, I don't know. But that seems to be where my children get their ideas from. So TikTok interpretive dance engages young people. More seriously, we have a responsibility to talk up the opportunities, actually, because if we constantly talk about how hard and how tough and how depressing it is, why would anybody want to get into that industry? If we talk about the bright future, about the opportunity, the innovation, the research, the feeding the world, the stuff I talked about a little bit earlier, that's the kind of stuff that will energise people and make them think, Joe, I want to feed the world, I want to feed the country, I want to save my corner of the county, create change, a bright future. That's upon all of us to go out with that energy and say, right, let's use the technical abilities that are out there, take the advice that's available from business and ensure we're acting in a productive and therefore creating a profitable future. In terms of how the supply chain works, I think there are some real challenges there. We've got the grocery supply code adjudicator still in place. There are some issues for me around what the future looks like when it comes to net zero, because there is a cost of going net zero, and our target of being net zero by 2050 probably does need an honest conversation with the consumer at large about what the price of delivering that will be, because it can't carry on at the rate we're at. Now, as to whether a £4 chicken is the right price, maybe innovation will lead to that. But we do have some of the cheapest food in the world. And I know if you've got a housing crisis and you're struggling to put food on the table, that is a real challenge. But if we're addressing the housing pressure, there has to be an element of how do we ensure there is a fair return to the farmer. Maybe public money for public good comes into that. Maybe policy change elsewhere is what we should be looking at.
Thank you. And
Thank you, Sarah.
Jesse, do you have any final words to summarise?
I don't really have very much to add. I think it's been a very helpful and interesting conversation. I'm not going to opine on what the price of chicken ought to be, not least because I have plenty of constituents who are, very pleased that it is the price it is. And I have a very large chicken producer in Sun Valley, which does a phenomenal job in creating a high-quality product at a low cost. But the general problem, which is that we cannot get away from the without a concerted, thoughtful, and kind of sustained approach, which we cannot get away from, the imbalance we have between the consumer and the producer interest. Whatever you think about the price of a piece of individual chicken remains true, and it'll be very interesting. I mean, my worry with the Labour government at the moment is that they're not taking enough interest or won't take enough interest in farming, but they may do, and maybe this is something which they will direct their attention to. We must hope so, because there is a problem, and it isn't one that was actually properly addressed, and I don't think the grocery adjudicator and the supermarket champion were a solution to that problem in the last government.
So on that note about the future of British farming and also the future generations, that brings this event to a close. I want to thank our partner CropLife UK for partnering with Bright Blue for this Fringe event, and also to all of our excellent panellists for all of their thoughtful contributions to the discussion. Please do stay around for the next 10 minutes or so as we have some networking time, and there should be some refreshments as well. And just to let you know, if you do want to sign up to be a member of Bright Blue so you can access all of our events and resources, membership is £20 or £10 for students. And lastly, as you would have seen, we have our wonderful Fringe guides on your seats. So do take a look at those, and do come along to more of the events we have on offer later today and also tomorrow. So would you all just join me in applauding our panellists for their contributions? Thank you very much.